Hey there, Perfect Peeps. Back on another Perfect Dad Dev. We have Lee Briggs in the house from Pulumi. How's it going, Lee?
It's great. Thanks. Thanks very much for having me, Alex.
It's awesome having you on after we had a quick discussion about Pulumi. I had to talk more about it, so this is pretty cool. I'm excited to dive in a little bit further. So just kind of a highlight, basically, Pulumi allows you to create modern infrastructure as code using any cloud, using familiar languages and tools. So the best part of Pulumi is that it's 100% open source. I've actually played around with it since we last talked, and it is pretty neat. I'm really excited to dive in a little more. The first thing that I want to chat about is basically I know what Pulumi is, but what is infrastructure as code and why does Pulumi fit?
Yeah, sure. So a little background about myself, so that you can be sure that I know what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
I kind of come from more of an operations focused world, a system administration type world, and infrastructure as code has been something that has been around in that kind of environment for quite some time. So previously, you would talk about tools, configuration management tools like Puppet and Ansible, and then a new series of tools kind of has appeared over the last 5 years that really deal with interacting with cloud resources. So Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Azure. And a lot of these tools that are available are either very specific to a single cloud provider, or they have uniqueness that means that you have to learn a kind of unique configuration language or a special language that means you like have a learning curve when you want to kind of follow these practices. Pulumi is designed to use the languages that you are familiar with in your application development lifecycle. So it allows you to declaratively define your infrastructure, but in a language that you're familiar with that could be imperative. For example, Go, TypeScript, JavaScript, Python, and .NET languages like C# and F# are all available as Pulumi, what we call Pulumi SDKs. And this means that the learning curve to kind of get started with infrastructure as code is dramatically reduced because you don't have to go and learn this whole new kind of configuration format or understand like a really complex YAML file. It's kind of languages that you feel familiar with.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I've dealt with some infrastructure as code tools. Do you find it's easier to adapt because you're living in your own language at that point, or is there still kind of some nuance to it?
I think there's still nuance, but I can only talk from my own experience as somebody who was probably a stronger infrastructure person than I was software developer.
Okay.
Um, learning the ideas and principles behind software development, but in the kind of area of infrastructure meant that I became a stronger software engineer by using Pulumi. And I think the reverse is true. If you find that you are a great software engineer, but you kind of get confused by the idea of cloud infrastructure and cloud computing and cloud providers, being able to access those things via the language that you already know and you're familiar with, I think really kind of increases the learning curve and stops you feeling so overwhelmed about everything.
Yeah, I have to admit that it's pretty frustrating so I would consider myself more of a front end developer, but somewhat full stack as well. And it's super difficult in my mind to start learning. It's almost like a whole new concept. Like, yeah, I get there's databases and there's servers or whatever else you need to stand up back there, but having to dive in and now I got to learn like cloud formation and VTLs and all this stuff. It's like, oh my gosh, it's just one more thing that you have to do. So it's really cool to figure that out or to have that tool set in your own language, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I, again, like in my previous career, I've been the person who was trying to teach developers about these concepts. And the thing that really surprised me was that, I really like learning these kind of new languages that aren't quite, full programming languages. But a lot of the time, like, you just want to get your application from your laptop into the cloud so that people can use it. And being able to use a tool that speaks your language is, a massive leg up, really.
Yeah, for sure. So why would someone want to adopt infrastructure as code? I mean, is it going to simplify your world the first time? Like, if you're a MVP, would you suggest immediately diving into it, or is it something that you want to maybe get to kind of gradually? What's your view on that?
I think it really does depend on your circumstances, but I think when you're trying to get your idea off the ground and you just kind of want to iterate quickly and see how things work, it might be the case that you just kind of go into the AWS console and you kind of click around in there and create an API gateway or a Lambda function and upload your Lambda function manually. But I think a lot of people listening along might find that eventually that feels like it just doesn't really work anymore. Especially if you're in a situation where it's not just yourself, but multiple people kind of working on the same thing. It's really, really hard to know what somebody's changed if you're just clicking around in the console. And there always reaches a point, whether you're in kind of MVP stages or, if you're in, further down the line, where you start to realize that you need to be able to kind of roll back to a good state, or you need to be able to know what happened at a certain time. And this is where infrastructure as code really kind of takes its own path, because it means that you are following the familiar software development lifecycle that you're probably used to in your front end or back end application stuff, like peer review, version control, so you can roll back if there's issues, all the kind of great stuff that you're used to. You can now apply it to the infrastructure that's running your application. It's auditable, it's repeatable. If you a great example that I always use is, especially if you're in the MVP stage, let's say you want to turn things off during the evening when you're not working, and then you want to get back to a known good state tomorrow. The amount of work that you have to do to actually do that in the console can often be quite laborious. Whereas if you kind of adopt infrastructure as code early on in your journey, you can just do Pulumi up, and everything's kind of going to be in a working state the way it was yesterday. And there's a bunch of other really great benefits as you add more teams, but that's what I always like to think of. Like, it might seem daunting to adopt this early on, but it's going to save you time later. I think anybody who's trying to get like a small application up and running will probably run into the same feelings where they're kind of like, I don't really want to do this again for the 500th time, So yeah, I think infrastructure as code is something that's been with me for a long time. But if you're kind of new to it, I think it's worth learning, even if you're in the early stages, but don't waste too much time early on. Like, kind of get things up and running, and then it kind of usually feels obvious when the right time is.
Yeah, I kind of feel like if you're used to serverless or infrastructure as code, that's kind of building things out like that. The interesting part for me is that it's like second nature. At some point you start to dive into it, and instead of like, oh, I'm going to go to the Firebase console, or I'm going to go to the AWS console, you're actually like, okay, I've got this kind of architecture laid out in my mind, or actually in an architectural blueprint, and I can just start kind of coding it up and working through that procedure before we even hit the console, which is fantastic, because then all the interconnections are there. You don't have to worry about API keys leaking out later on. All of those like really, really nice to have items that sit within there. The part for me, and maybe you can help me understand this. So you spoke to it a little bit. When you're in that MVP mode, if you have all of that documented up and you spin down like all of your resources, is there a way that the data is able to be saved when you're kind of in that infrastructure as code too? So like, let's say I spin up a new Amplify site, which has DynamoDB in the back of that. Is there a functionality there that's going to say, well, we had this up for a day and we ended up adding this many users or these blog posts or whatever it might be? Are you having a way to pull in that data and add that to like your scripts within infrastructure as code, or is that something kind of separate?
Well, it kind of depends on where your data layer is, right? Like if you were using a standard SQL database, running a backup before you shut down the database and then restoring that, that's super easy. DynamoDB has a similar concept. You can kind of back up those things to buckets. It's kind of outside of the infrastructure as code mentality. And I think for me, the idea that you if you have data that's in there that's important, having good backup practices is a really good idea, but you probably don't want to be destroying it on a regular basis. And there's ways within your infrastructure as code tooling, whichever you choose, and obviously I would highly recommend Pulumi, but there's ways within your infrastructure as code tooling to kind of separate those critical things that's in your data layer from the things that you can kind of do without, like your front end and back end applications. And that's usually what you would find in terms of best practices, like a bunch of different things. Like CloudFormation has stacks, for example. You might have one stack for your database and one stack for your
like app
your web, your web tier or whatever. And then like in Pulumi, we have this concept of projects and stacks as well that allows you to kind of separate those two things. So it's flexible enough so that you can kind of achieve those things and allow you to kind of just save money where you need to and kind of create repeatability where you need to. Obviously, as a former operations person, good backups are important. Do that early. You'll save yourself a lot of heartache if you do that early.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, let me click the banner here. Do you actually find that infrastructure as code ends up taking longer, or is it kind of just a skill that you start to realize, I have to have this because of repeatability or scalability or whatever you want to talk through?
I thought a lot about this question after we kind of did the preparation, and I thought of an analogy which I think really applies in this particular situation. So I think everybody who's done any kind of IT work probably started out with a traditional kind of GUI on their local machine. They might have done, let's say you're copying a folder from one place to another. It feels pretty easy a lot of the time to copy that folder in like the Finder or Windows Explorer. And then as you start to understand that there's this thing called the terminal, it feels harder to begin with. It's got that learning curve, and it's got a bit of a bit of difficulty at the start. But I certainly, and I'm sure there's many people out there listening who feel the same way, I certainly don't think I could go back the other way. Like it feels natural now for me to move things around in the terminal or to operate in the terminal, or to operate in your, even if you look at things from an IDE perspective, like if you use VS Code or another IDE, kind of doing things, hand editing them, but on like text files was made sense originally. And then as you get all those kind of new features in the IDE, it feels like second nature. And I think infrastructure as code has a very similar like learning curve. The first 2 or 3 times that you're going to do it is probably going to feel a little frustrating. I certainly think it feels less frustrating if you're using something like Pulumi, but it feels a little frustrating. And then, in 4 to 6 weeks or any other hypothetical amount of time, you almost feel like it's second nature and you just could not ever go back to doing it the other way. And I really like that kind of idea that it's a journey that you're going on, and it's just that you have to kind of take that decision to step from what you know into something that is going to be easier later on down the line. So to give you a more succinct answer, it does have a learning curve. It's not easy the first time. You do have to learn some new concepts. But ultimately, it's going to give you a lot of benefits in the long run, and it's going to make your life a lot easier.
So when we talk about like it would take a little bit of time, I've found switching from like Google Cloud Platform over to AWS, and I have dabbled in the Azure side of things, mostly on the DevOps side of builds and things. But I feel as though every single one of those platforms takes a long time to understand the products and understand kind of what you're doing. Do you think infrastructure as code helps to abstract that a little more, where you need a data layer, and so I think in serverless or Terraform, I can't remember. I haven't used many of them in a while, but there's a way to generically kind of say I need this thing. Is that something that Pulumi also helps with, or do you have to still know the underlying product or cloud platform, I should say, very specifically when you're trying to do this?
So we, one of the things that we have is the Pulumi Cloud library, which tries to abstract some of these concepts away. So, I just want a database, and I don't care what cloud provider I'm in. Pulumi has the capability of building that, and we have some stuff in preview that kind of shows examples of that. But ultimately, like if you're building an application, you still kind of need to know underneath what things you need, and you have the decisions to make. Like, do I use DynamoDB? Do I use MySQL or RDS or one of the other cloud providers data layers? And I totally understand where you're coming from. Like, sometimes you go into these cloud providers and you click on all the products that are available, and it's just this overwhelming list of 500 different things.
Yeah.
I don't think Pulumi is really going to kind of make that easier. Certainly in the short term, but in the long term, that's something that we hope to be able to achieve of kind of making these off-the-shelf libraries that just say, hey, I want a database, and I don't really know which cloud provider I'm working in, but here's the database that I'm asking for. And we have the building blocks available to do that. And if you work in an organization that has multiple cloud providers, you can build your own as well. That's another thing that Pulumi allows you to do.
Oh, really?
So like if you work at a company and you have a set of best practices around your infrastructure, like you want everybody to use API gateway, you can build libraries that are reshareable and reusable. We call them components, that allow you to say to anybody who's even less familiar with this than yourself, you just say, hey, just npm install this package and then fill out some of the defaults, and it will do everything in the way that we expect. And this is something that we see. This is something we see our customers using on a regular basis, to build these best practices for people.
Does that have to then get pulled into all of your different SDKs, or is there some magic happening there?
There's some magic in the backend. So, like, let's say we have this library that we call AWS X or Crosswalk, and this is abstracting a lot of like the best practices for like if you want to build a VPC in AWS, or if you want to, spin up a database in AWS. That is literally just an installable npm package, and the magic is happening in the kind of what we call the Pulumi engine, and it allows you to kind of declaratively declare what you want these best practices to look like. And if you go and look at it, it's Pulumi-AWX or AWS X on GitHub. It's just a standard TypeScript library. It just follows best practice TypeScript stuff, and so there's a bunch of interfaces and a bunch of exported classes that you can use. But you can build these yourself very easily as well.
Cool. Okay, so I think just to turn the corner a little bit and focus kind of more on the Pulumi product as a whole, which we have a little bit, but kind of tying in that infrastructure as code. So what makes Pulumi different? I think I kind of shopped it around. I'm like, hey guys, over in my day job, my regular company, I'm like, hey, what does this actually do versus like Terraform? And they're like, oh, it's Terraform under the hood. What is this thing? And so can you talk through why like this is so much different, or how it applies to those different those different infrastructure as code packages?
Yeah, I think one of the things that in my day job as a Pulumi engineer, one of the things that I deal with the most is like, isn't this just Terraform under the hood? And I could say on record categorically that that's not the case. The Pulumi, how Pulumi is related to Terraform is that some of our providers, i.e. the things that interact with the cloud provider that you might be using, for example, AWS or something more nuanced, like say Cloudflare as a DNS provider, we use their CRUD schema, so their create, replace, update, delete schema. We use that to actually pass that into what we call the Pulumi engine. And so the only thing that we actually use is the output of like all of the API specification. And the reason that we do that is because there's so many cloud providers out there that for us to build native providers, directly from the APIs is going to be extremely time intensive. We do have several providers that are built directly from the upstream cloud provider's API, one of which is Azure. So if you are using Azure as a cloud provider, we have full 100% API compatibility and coverage with Azure by building our provider directly from them. And the same happens with Kubernetes if you are lucky or unlucky enough to be using Kubernetes. So that's the kind of difference between Terraform in terms of how it operates. In terms of the user experience, again, like we have a native SDK in the language that you feel familiar with. And we've seen time and time again that the feel of using Terraform versus the feel of using Pulumi is a very different experience. And a lot of people that have adopted Pulumi kind of have this magical moment where they just realize that they no longer have to kind of deal with this syntax that is unfamiliar with them. And the levels of productivity that tend to happen is obviously quite surprising. There are other things in the market that that you might be familiar with. CloudFormation is another one. It's always worth remembering that CloudFormation is AWS native specific. So again, if your DNS registrar, if it's in Cloudflare, you can't use CloudFormation to do that without some tricks and things hurdles you got to jump through. And I personally, I will say this is just a personal opinion, having used CloudFormation for very many years. CloudFormation got me into more trouble than it got me out of. Like you end up with stacks that are stuck or like aren't able to update, or for some reason the stack is set to update in progress and you don't know why. And and again, like that is something that I've run into personally.
Same.
And it just feels like a black box that you just can't ever debug. And I distinctly remember engaging the AWS support once about a stuck CloudFormation stack and them not even knowing how to fix it and telling me to delete it.
Does Pulumi actually allow you to figure those things out, or is that still going to be an issue?
Yeah, so Pulumi executes locally on your machine. So it's not like CloudFormation where you just send it off to AWS and the execution happens in the background without you actually knowing what's happening. It happens locally. So, you can run into problems. Pulumi stores the way that your infrastructure is supposed to look in its state. And you can manipulate that state locally if you need to. You can run commands locally if you get issues or debugging problems. The errors that get thrown are thrown to you immediately locally. You get a much quicker feedback loop than kind of dispatching something off to CloudFormation and kind of praying a little bit and hoping for the best. And that's not to disparage CloudFormation in a lot of ways. Like the serverless framework I know uses CloudFormation under the hood. And it's just a kind of nice abstraction around CloudFormation. It kind of does its job, but as soon as you want to kind of operate across cloud providers, you need a different thing. And that's what we offer. We have, I think last count, and I'd have to go and count again, but I think last count we had over 40 different providers, and new ones being added every day. So it's.
I'm going to throw. Not in that view. I'm not. I'm going to throw the site up here for those on YouTube. This will make total sense. If you're listening to the podcast, I'd really tell you to go check out YouTube after you get done and see some of this, but I'll try to describe it as we go through it. So I have the Pulumi website up on the screen right now, and it's just kind of walking through a few different things of how you kind of create and then do deploy and manage. As we're talking about kind of those different providers and things, I want to just go through each one a little bit to understand when we say things like, well, serverless is doing CloudFormation, and I've experienced that. Going from Amplify, it takes forever for CloudFormation to finish, to serverless, which actually just like uploads it all to S3, and it seems magically quicker. I don't know how, but someone tried to describe it to me, and I agreed at that time. I'm not technical enough at that layer to understand it, but so I have up here kind of Pulumi and the serverless framework and how that's different. Do you mind if we walk through kind of some more specifics around why that's different?
Yeah, so the serverless framework, if you're familiar with it, like it uses what we would call in Pulumi a configuration language to actually define the state of your infrastructure. So you have a YAML template that will kind of define the state of how you want something to look. And then it kind of dispatches it off to CloudFormation, and CloudFormation does the actual execution and kind of takes care of that. One of the problems that kind of comes up regularly for customers who are migrating from serverless to Pulumi is that they've reached that point in their kind of generation of infrastructure where they need to have lots of different configuration values, or they need to do things, say if you want to have things in different AWS regions, or you want to have differences between your development and your production infrastructure. As soon as you start to have to deal with that YAML, you end up doing things like templating. You end up doing things like variable substitution inside the YAML document, and it can be it can be incredibly error prone, and it can cause you more problems than you actually solve. With Pulumi, because it's using the language that you're familiar with, and we have strong typing as well inside those SDKs, especially for something like TypeScript or Go, if you're familiar with that. Like, it allows you, while you're actually writing your infrastructure, to kind of get that feedback as you go along. It won't execute anything until the actual application compiles and gets deployed locally. So you don't have those problems where you have to wait those, several, even if it's via serverless, which is much quicker than via Amplify. Straight away as soon as you run Pulumi up that there's a problem with your code. And it allows you to kind of get rid of those kind of pain points. And again, like there's a comment here about a pile of bash scripts. I have been personally responsible for writing piles of bash scripts. I have nightmares sometimes about some of the bash scripts that I've written. And they're incredibly error prone, and they can cause you some serious problems. And as you get to the stage where your customers are using your infrastructure, you want to have a high degree of confidence that when you run it, it's going to work. And in a lot of these kind of bash script YAML file type things, that's not always the case. There's extensive documentation out there on the internet about how this bash script brought the entire website down, or this incorrectly formatted YAML file was brought something down and broke something. And this just doesn't happen with Pulumi's kind of approach to things.
So I've done like the basics of Pulumi and gone through the setups and some of the Git repo items, but my understanding of like how that would be prevented, I still am not quite there. So if you were to kind of create a Pulumi, I don't know if you call it a script or a program.
Yeah.
Okay, a program. When you're compiling that, how do you know before it hits? So I'm used to AWS CloudFormation hitting a point and going, whoa, that database isn't there, and it completely crashes down. Are those the kind of things that Pulumi can help prevent, or is it still, it can prevent a lot in the program itself, but once it goes up, there could be additional issues still?
It's more the former. So one of the things that Pulumi really wants you to do, or any kind of infrastructure code thing expects you to do, is define all of your infrastructure from within the program. So let's say my RDS database is not defined via Pulumi. I can reference that via what we call a GET request, and then pass it to the other parts of my Pulumi infrastructure program. And if that doesn't exist, it will say, could not find this database, and it will stop at that moment. But obviously the best practice is to define your database and your web application together, deploy them as one, and you can reference the things between them. So one of the things that Pulumi has is this concept of outputs. And so when you create an RDS database, you get a bunch of things back from AWS, like the entry point, the ARN, like the URL. You can then pass that to your other resources, like your web tier, directly. And sometimes if you want, you can even do that directly into your application. And so let's say you're kind of creating a Lambda function behind an API gateway. You can be very, very confident that the database URL is exactly what you need it to, even if that changes for some reason. And you could pass it all the way down into your application in the same language that you're familiar with. And that obviously means that you're in a position where you don't have to have those kind of things you mentioned where you're like, hey, this database doesn't exist. And like, you kind of throw your hands up and go, oh, well, okay. And then kind of go back the other way. So, without actually being able to kind of show an example, and there's plenty of examples on the website if you kind of take a look at,
Sure. Maybe we'll have you on outside of the podcast and just do a full-on demo on for like Coding Cat. We'll do a blog or something and
absolutely.
dive into do some examples there. So I think my buddies at work will kill me if I don't like harp on this some more. So I think we covered it a little bit, but you were kind of saying like, yeah, you hear that a lot, that Terraform's still under the hood. Like how does it use Terraform? How does it not? Can you talk through that for me at least, so I can go back to work and be like, no, this is how it works.
So without actually, on the website for those people watching on online, if you kind of go and look at how it works, and it's on the left there, architecture and concepts.
Cool.
That's the one. And then there's a how it works page. How Pulumi works at the bottom there, on the left. There we go. So essentially, the difference between us and any other kind of infrastructure as code platform is we have this Pulumi engine, right? And that is the thing that actually talks directly to the cloud provider's API. And so if you're creating something in Azure or you're creating something in AWS, the create, the update, and the delete actual execution is an engine that we have built that takes information from your language SDK, whether that be TypeScript or Go or F#, and translates it into a create, update, or delete process. Now, in order for us to actually be able to create the SDK, we need to know what resources are actually available in AWS, in Azure, in Terraform. Sorry, in Kubernetes, not Terraform. So we need to know what those resources are. So we need to know about all the RDS options, all the little configurable options that are available in RDS, and all the little configurable options that are available in Kubernetes or Azure. We need to know what those are. And in order to generate what we call the schema or the full list of options for any resource, we use the Terraform provider to generate that schema.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if you imagine a, let's say AWS published a full JSON document of all of its different API calls and all of the parameters that you could pass, we could use that to generate our provider, but they don't. Azure does have this, and we generate our provider directly from that API document. Kubernetes also has this, and we generate our provider directly from the Kubernetes API schema definition. So all of the different resources that are available, all the different functions that are available, we get that directly from those providers. But for those providers where we don't have that information, essentially what we do is we just generate all of the different create, replace, update, delete things from the Terraform provider, which has been, basically crowd shared over many, many years. Lots and lots of people have contributed to these providers. They are open source and they're under a permissive license, intentionally, because they are contributed to by many, many people. When AWS releases a new feature, which they will do lots of next week in reInvent, we will have to go through and add those resources manually to the providers that we use, and that's where we kind of quote unquote use Terraform.
So will you guys end up adding those yourself to your engine and your API calls, or will you wait until Terraform has them published? Or maybe you're doing the pull request and adding it. I don't know.
So one of my colleagues, great friend, is Paul Stack. He was one of the top 3 contributors to Terraform providers of all time. So he is, very, very familiar with Terraform, and we have forked providers, used upstream providers, contributed to upstream providers. Obviously, I will say that Terraform is obviously a competitor of ours, and so we have a relationship in which we contribute back where we need to and where we can, and but ultimately that's the relationship between us and Terraform. And I think one of the things that I would certainly like to do is kind of make sure that understanding, like the actual execution model, the engine and the CLI, it has nothing to do with Terraform at all. In fact, it's a completely different execution model that is more focused on the idea of eventual consistency and promises, rather than the way Terraform works, which is to kind of generate this graph of what all the possibilities are. So it's a very different mechanism of operating.
So we talked a minute, or I think I brought it up in the beginning. So Pulumi is still 100% open source. So it begs to ask the question: how are you guys making your money? Like, what is the operational piece to Pulumi?
So in terms of the open source, we have our CLI, which is open source and is available on GitHub under github.com/Pulumi/Pulumi. And then we have all of our providers, which are open source under the Pulumi organization. Again, if you are really interested in the inner workings of this kind of stuff, you can see how we make our providers. As I mentioned before, all of our language SDKs are generated programmatically from this schema that I talked about earlier, and they're all open source. We make our money from what we call the Pulumi console or Pulumi SaaS, and the Pulumi SaaS is the state management and visualization and auditing for you as an enterprise. So if you are using Pulumi, you have to make a decision about where you're going to store what we call the state. And that is, I've run Pulumi, I've created a bunch of cloud resources, and then what I need to do now is store that information about what the state of the world looks like somewhere. The default is under this website that you can see if you're watching the YouTube video, the Pulumi console, and it stores information about all of the resources that you've created, when they were created, who created them, the relationships between them. If you do, like, we have a plan that's available for individuals, and also we have paid plans for team collaboration. And so if you have multiple people working on the same project, then you can sign up for a team plan via Pulumi SaaS. If that's not your bag and that's not really where you want to go, there is also the open source backends, which allows you to store all of the state that I mentioned before in a object storage bucket. So Google Cloud, GCS, Azure Blob Store, or S3 buckets are all available as options for you to store your state. So if you don't want to kind of go down the path of having that state managed by a SaaS solution, you can use those object store buckets. What I will say is that Pulumi's uniqueness as well against some of the other competitors is that we never actually see any sensitive values. So when you use the Pulumi SaaS, if you have things like database passwords, those do not get stored in plain text, and we cannot even reverse them. So they're encrypted at rest and inside the state as well.
Very cool. So this is by no means a pitch. We're not currently sponsored by Pulumi or anything like this, and I just want to really check out the technical detail and if it would actually help in all of our projects. But with you going through that, I do just want to show for the folks that are on YouTube the pricing page, and then just kind of explain at the current time of this posting where it sits at. So for the things that I'm messing around with, it's in this community edition, which is awesome for open source product like this. I can mess around all day long and actually create these deployments for $0. So I was pretty excited about that, to be able to check it out. It looks like you guys have a team starter for like 3 team members for $50 and a 25 team Team Pro for $75, and then obviously some custom things that go on here as well. So I just want to bring that up before we jump into kind of our perfect picks, as we like to call them here on perfect.dev.
Yeah, what I will say is
perfect.fun. You're my first person on for the new season, and my wife and I started up a another thing called Perfect.fun, and it's bleeding into my podcast, unfortunately.
Awesome. Well, just a quick thing about the pricing page that you just
Yep.
saw is we are actually making some changes
Bring
to
it
the way
back
that look. We are making some changes to the way that looks as well. Like we've had pretty good feedback from the community that it's not always immediately obvious what's going on in here, and so we kind of have some changes coming to our pricing page, which I'm super excited about. That makes it a lot more obvious. Like you see at the top there, we've got the Pulumi Community Edition. If you scroll up there. Like we actually don't have a great thing on our pricing page that shows that you cannot use any of these cloud-hosted backends. It is available and it is there, but one of the pieces of feedback we've had is like, I don't want to use any of this stuff. So, we're making some great changes, and our wonderful new UX designer Susan is hard at work on that.
Very cool. Yeah, it's a good site already, so it'll be exciting to see the improvements. So one of the picks I will bring up here. I don't remember if you picked this or not. I have to bring up my sheet, but this is the Pulumi examples. So do you want to just talk a second about where this is at? I have it up on the screen. It's github.com/Pulumi/examples. And you guys have a ton of them. Do you just want to talk about it a minute?
Yeah, so one of the great things I think about this examples is it kind of covers all of the different languages that we support, and it covers lots of different cloud providers and lots of different scenarios. So we've got simple examples to more complex examples. We are hard at work on better ways to visualize this and make it available to people as they come along rather than just a big long list of examples. But it's I use this almost every day. If there is an example of something you would like to do, for example, you want to try out a Kubernetes cluster, or you want to create a small application with DynamoDB, there's probably information in the examples that will show you how to do that in Pulumi in the language of your choice. So this is a great reference for me. If you are interested in getting started with Pulumi, this is a great place to go. And most of these different examples can just be git cloned, and then you just run Pulumi up and it will just work essentially. And I'm responsible for curating those examples. So if you feel like you have a great example, please feel free to open a pull request and we'll get it added to the list.
Yeah, very cool. I was excited to see how much TypeScript. So I'm a Angular guy and live in TypeScript all the time. So my most recent project is all Node.js with JavaScript, no TypeScript. So it's been interesting going back to that world too.
Sure.
So just gonna kind of wrap it up there and do a little bit of the fun side of the house. Lee, I'm gonna put you on the spot to go first. What is your perfect pick for the day?
I think we both wanted to fight over this, but what I have been kind of doing in my downtime over the last couple of weeks is watching the new Netflix show, The Queen's Gambit. I think it's a fascinating TV show, and it's I'm a few episodes in, and it was extremely gripping. So I would highly recommend that. The second thing that I will also say is that I am as you can probably almost tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. I've lived here in Seattle for 3 years, and I'm a huge soccer fan. And my hometown club of Burnley is a Premier League soccer team, and nobody's ever heard of them.
Should we call it football, just so you know?
We can call it football. Yeah, for sure.
Other listeners understand.
Yeah, we can call it football. But like it's my labor of love for many years. And if you are a soccer fan and you support Manchester United or Liverpool or any other kind of big name English Premier League team, then don't forget about lonely Burnley. It's something that it's the town that I grew up in, and I always like to get an opportunity to talk to people about it.
That's super exciting.
So yeah,
very cool. My pick for today, at least for this cast, I got another cast coming after this one, as you can tell, the date's coming up, but we are approaching quickly AWS re:Invent. So this might be my pick for a couple days. And the biggest reason I'm picking this and going to keep driving it home, this is going to be the first time, and maybe you've heard of it, that they are doing this completely free. And that is not like AWS at all. Usually it's like, I don't know, I want to say it's close to $1,000 usually. So It goes for 3 weeks this year, and there's going to be a ton of content covered. And I'm just kind of blown away that it's all going to be free. So I think they are supposed to release the agenda soon. Maybe it finally snuck out there, but this will be one of my perfect picks for a while, just to remind people that it's coming up. I also wanted to pick Queen's Gambit, but since I can't do that on the Netflix side, I'm going to pick the Unicorn. I think it's just called The Unicorn. It's a fun little show about a dad that his wife has passed away and what that means. So they start the show about a year in, and it's pretty fun to watch and fall asleep to usually, but it's a kind show.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other last thoughts, Lee, as we wrap it up?
Yeah, the only thing I will say is that over the next couple of weeks, as we kind of come up to reInvent, I will be doing an introduction to Pulumi workshop, which is available on our website. It is free to sign up, and it will take you through all of the kind of basics getting started of Pulumi and introduce you to terminology. So I'll be running at least 3 of those sessions over the next 3 weeks. So if anything that I've talked about sounds compelling, then please feel free to join me.
Awesome. Very cool. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Lee. I hope to have you back on. We'll do some stuff on the YouTube channel to demo Pulumi and get some blogs out there for it. It's such a neat product.
Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Thanks. Bye now.